Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we are taking a look at Messianic Theology with Dr. Joshua Jipp, Professor of New Testament at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and the author of The Messianic Theology of the New Testament. It's available, just follow the link below. So Dr. Jipp, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here, Dennis.
So to get started, can you give us a brief background, the motivation, what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, in brief, it started maybe 6-7 years ago when I started on a project on Paul and was exploring the question of whether the Greek word Christos, it's often translated as just Christ in our New Testaments, but whether it was just a name, sort of like the last name for Jesus, he's first name Jesus, second name Christ, or if it actually was communicating something more than that he is the Messiah of Yahweh that's spoken of in the Old Testament and all kinds of Jewish literature. I wrote a book arguing that it was the case, that it was more, this is a title. Jesus is not just, the Christ is another name, but that he is God's Messiah, anointed, his king. And I argued that with respect to Paul. But I started to think that actually the entire New Testament makes a lot of good sense in terms of understanding one of, not its only, but one of its central themes being originating out of basically the early Christian confession, Jesus is the Messiah. So from Matthew to Revelation, one of the things that all of these New Testament texts agree upon is that Jesus is the Messiah of Yahweh, the anointed one. And so I wanted to write a book sort of showing how each New Testament text in its own sort of creative theological way was expanding on what it means that Jesus is God's anointed or God's Messiah.
And before we get into the scriptures that inform your theology, what was the contemporary view or views amongst Jewish teachers of the time of Christ?
Yeah, it would be hard to say that there, here is sort of like one standard view, but by and large, I think we can start with the word Christos as being sort of a shorthand abbreviation for the anointed of Yahweh or the anointed of the Lord. So the old, first century, many Jewish texts would have understood that basically this communicated a depiction of a figure that's spoken of, for example, originating in 2 Samuel 7 and then going throughout the Psalms, where God makes promises to the house of David that there's going to be his household, and will even be one from his household who will be, we could, in colloquial terms, say God's right-hand person, the agent, the mediator, the earthly representative through whom God is going to enact his covenantal and kingdom purposes to rule the world, bless the world, and bring his purposes to their accomplishment.
All right, and as we go, you'll have an opportunity to distinguish more between Jesus' view of Messiah compared to what people were expecting at the time in terms of power and violence.
Ways that might have been surprising, absolutely, yeah.
All right, so could you go into some depth then about your view of the Old Testament, which particular scriptures you think are essential for understanding Messiah?
I think, there's a lot that I could say, but let me just give maybe two that really stand out. 2 Samuel 7 is 12 through 14 in particular is really key, where Nathan the prophet is speaking to David, right, and says, right, I am going to raise a promise to David. I am going to raise up a kingdom, right, or establish my kingdom through you and through your seed. Right, your seed or your offspring that's going to come from, right, David and his household, right, is going to be, God says, I'm going to be a father to him. He's going to be a son to me, okay? So in 2 Samuel 7, and you get it reaffirmed in 1 Chronicles 17, you have basically, right, the Old Testament taking shape in a way that God is going to use the house of David and the descendants of David, particularly an anointed or a king that is going to, as I said before, rule and enact God's purposes. There's a lot of other texts we could look at, but maybe the Psalter, Israel's Psalms, right, are maybe one of the best places to look for some of this, Jewish or Old Testament Messianic theology. So you get things like, right, in Psalm 1, right, there is an emphasis on love of wisdom and love of Torah, God's law. And then Psalm 2, there's a promise that basically there is going to be a messianic anointed of the Lord. The language, I think it's in verse 6 or verse 7, Christos is used there in the Greek text, the Messiah of the Lord, who's going to enact God's purposes. And he's basically going to be one that loves God's law and he loves wisdom, right? And throughout the Psalter, you actually have a depiction of this person like David, or David speaking Psalms as God's anointed, as one who is righteous, as one who loves God, as one who is also surprisingly at times persecuted. He's suffering as the wicked are, for a variety of reasons, trying to assault him, so on and so forth. Let me just say one more. There's a variety of these, Psalm 72, I'll maybe say a couple more. Psalm 72 is beautiful depiction where it's basically a prayer for David's son Solomon, that there will be this ideal ruler that will rule God's people with justice and righteousness. The poor will be blessed by him. It will lead to, the blessing for all of the cosmos, the entire world, fertility, so on and so forth. And then truly the last one, Psalm 89. So it begins sort of in the first few verses where they say, God, you promised these amazing promises. He's just quoting 2 Samuel 7 here, to our ancestor David. And then it says, but we look all around us and we're in shambles. Jerusalem's been destroyed, right? Where are your promises, oh God? And so there's this affirmation of hope and longing, right? Even though the Davidic monarchy, there's probably no one sitting on the throne at this time, but this hope and desire that God is going to be faithful to the promises that he made to David in 2 Samuel 7 and raise up this faithful king that will rule over God's people. So even in the time of exile, or in the time where you don't have one sitting on the throne, you still have Israelites or Jews that are praying the Psalms, right, and expecting and hoping and longing for a day when God will enact the fulfillment of these promises that he made to them. So I could go on, but those are just a few of the places in the Old Testament that I would want to highlight with a couple of minutes at least.
All right, and we'll get to Isaiah 52 and 53 when we're looking at the crucifixion and resurrection. And all right, great. Now, throughout the New Testament, then you're obviously there's a lot to say about the Messianic theology as you understand it. What are the key scriptures for you there?
I mean, well, to some extent, it's all of them. It's Matthew to Revelation. It's this one of the things that's if I go back to your original question, why did I write the book or what motivated me? To some extent, there was an element of why as Christians do we read these texts? We've got 27 documents in our New Testament. It's not hard to find differences. It's not hard to find diversity. I mean, we have 4 different gospels, in fact, right, within our canon that are giving us a depiction of one figure, Jesus, but are also telling their story in different ways. So one of the questions, one of the things that's interesting to me is that, if we're asking why read these 27 texts, what unifies them? I mean, I think we could say you'd have a variety of different responses, but one of them is they all agree with the early Christian confession, Jesus is the Christ, right? So Matthew 1:1, right, begins basically with God's people having sort of been in exile, and it recounts in the genealogy 1:1 through 17, basically a long list of these Israelite and Jewish kings, right? When in many ways, right, telling the story of Israel as a story of sin and exile and longed for restoration. A lot of those kings are not good kings, for example, right? Centering upon the one who is the son of David, right? So son of David, the descendant of David, hopefully already even in the first 10 minutes that will ring bells of 2 Samuel 7. or the Gospel of Luke, right, that begins with the angel Gabriel coming to Mary and saying, the child that you have, that you are carrying right now, he is the one who will sit on David's throne and rule over God's people forever. Or you could look at the book of Acts, where when the people say, "Are you drunk with wine?" when there's the outpouring of the Spirit, or they're trying to make sense of it. And Peter's go-to texts are the Psalms of David to basically say, David in Psalm 16 and in a variety of other Psalms looked forward to, right, this one that would be seated to the right hand of God and would give the Spirit. And he's quoting Psalm 16, Psalm 132, Psalm 110. Right? I could keep going and just sort of like say, what are the texts that I'm looking at? They're basically places in the New Testament from Matthew all the way to the end of Revelation, where you have some of the most theologically important aspects of our New Testament texts that are using Jewish messianism or Old Testament depictions of the Christ to explain the identity of Jesus of Nazareth. So I hope that in a nutshell makes some sense to you. But
okay, good. And could you say a brief word about when New Testament writers take scriptures from the Old Testament that are not messianic, but then they make them messianic? Do they even have the right to do that?
Do you have any example that kind of comes to mind in terms of where you?
No.
I would say, most of my understanding would be that they are, if we're using for me, at least how I use the language of messianic, I don't necessarily mean any important Old Testament text that the New Testament author uses, right? So a good example of this could be Isaiah 53, which there's a lot of debate in terms of, is that a messianic text within the Old Testament? Is it, or is the background more Mosaic? Is it an ideal prophet? Some have argued that it is Davidic. Most of my argument is made within the New Testament with respect to specific texts. And here we're talking about 2 Samuel 7 or Ezekiel 34 and the expectation for a Davidic shepherd, or Amos 9 and the restoration of Israel through the house of David, or a variety of different Psalms. My method is more to look very specifically at these texts that are arguably messianic within their own context. So I don't, people might look at my book and say, well, why don't you have more of a role for Isaiah 53? It does show up in a few places. Or why don't you talk more about the greater prophet than Moses that Deuteronomy 18 talks about? Fair question. I'm more trying to make the argument with respect to specifically messianic texts, which is a handful of these oracles centering on the house of David that usually use the language of Messiah within them.
All righty. And so you spent a lot of time in a couple of different chapters on the life of Christ, incarnation, death, resurrection, both in chapters on Christology and soteriology, that is salvation. So could you go into some depth here on how you see these different events within the life of Christ relating to Christology and soteriology from a messianic perspective?
Yeah, I guess one way to say it would be this. I don't want to get too laborious in terms of scholarly views on things. But there's been I think a really good recent trend in New Testament studies that has argued, with names like Richard Bauckham and Larry Hurtado, that the earliest Christology was actually very high Christology. And they've argued that, hey, we see Jesus of Nazareth doing the kinds of things that Yahweh or the God of Israel is doing in the Old Testament, things oriented towards creation, things oriented towards sovereignty. In other words, things that should be reserved for God alone, determining people's final destinies in terms of salvation. And I think that's been actually a really helpful trend. One area, though, where I think sort of like, paying a little closer to the messianic texture of the New Testament texts would be in this. Whereas Bauckham can tend to, or people talking about Jesus being included with the divine in the divine identity, can tend to almost speak of God and Jesus as they're right. I mean, we're getting pushed into Trinitarian language here. In terms of the same essence, they don't do as good. They're not able often to do as good a job in terms of making distinctions in terms of difference with respect to their persons. So I think the Old Testament with respect to messianic texts, I will be a father to him and he will be a son to me, or places where Psalm 89 is speaking about Yahweh accomplishing his purposes through his firstborn descent, through his firstborn, language that's used for the Davidic king. In some ways, by attending to these texts more closely, I think we're able to see ways in which Jesus is included within the divine identity, or is, just use the language of, he is divine. But we're also able to see ways in which the God the Father and God the Son are actually identified, are distinguished in terms of they actually are distinct persons. The New Testament isn't exactly using this language. It's obviously will get clarified later in the early church, with the high point being Nicaea. But I really think in some ways, the Messianic theology is starting to, is helping the New Testament, both do these two things, if I can state it as simply as possible, draw together Father and Son as one essence, but also make distinctions between Father and Son as distinct persons as well.
Okay, and how about the crucifixion then? What is central about that messianically?
Yeah, I mean, the cross, especially in the Gospels, you would think maybe would be the least messianic, sort of event in terms of on the cross, you have one who dies the most shameful imaginable death. In many ways is abandoned by everyone except the women who are standing at a distance. You could go on and on. It shouldn't be too hard for us to see him as, on the cross as, apparently a victim, or as one who's seemingly powerless. The New Testament texts, however, want us to do something that's really hard, which is to basically see cross and Messiah as together. So whether it's the Gospel of Mark, Matthew as well, and you have Jesus basically crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or where are you, He's crying out from a Davidic psalm in terms of Psalm 22. Or in the Gospel of Luke, I think it's Psalm 30 or 31, He's quoting the words of David the king. Father, into your hands, I commend my spirit. What's going on, in other words, is that, in my understanding, is that basically Jesus is playing the role of the Davidic messianic sufferer of the Psalms. If you've ever read any of these Psalms, you see there's this depiction, surprisingly, of a Davidic king that's saying things like, God, I love you and I trust you, but where are you? I'm being, my mockers are walking by and they're mocking me, and they're wagging their tongues at me, and they're spitting upon me, and they're giving me even sort of this sour wine or whatever it is. They're standing at a distance. Nevertheless, I trust you, God. I affirm you, God. And there's expectation for vindication on the other side of it. So Jesus, I think, for all of the gospel authors, is sort of undergoing that role of the messianic Davidic sufferer who seems to be abandoned by God as he suffers as the singular righteous one, who is but nevertheless is continuing to place his hope and his confidence and his expectation in God to rescue him and to deliver him. And so, long story short, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they want us to see basically this is a very ironic depiction of a king, This is a surprisingly not what we would expect in terms of a powerful, triumphant, victorious sort of anointed king. But it's one that we shouldn't be surprised by if we've read the Old Testament scriptures, As Jesus plays this role, embodies it, and on the other side of the cross is vindicated as God resurrects him from the dead. I can't, I'll stop here after this. I know I've gone on for a minute. I can't overemphasize just how important it is for Christians to be familiar with the book of the Psalms, right? To understand, not just to nourish their own spiritual lives, although certainly that, but also to understand the important role it plays with respect to Christology, or understanding the identity of Jesus as he's consistently praying these Psalms. And the authors of the New Testament are using them in many ways as the categories or the scriptures to make sense, really, of his identity.
So you just mentioned the resurrection vindicating Christ. Can you say more about that, how it ties in with everything else?
Sure. The New Testament texts, maybe the best way to, there's so many different passages we could go to here, but again, maybe Acts is one of the better ones here. So in Acts 2, I referenced this briefly before, but when Peter first quotes Joel 2 to say, the speaking in tongues is something that Joel talked about. And then he goes on to say, and furthermore, he's basically going to say, this is where the Spirit has come from, right? He goes on then to say, the Psalm 16 speaks about someone that was, right, the speaker is saying to God, I enjoy delights at your right hand forever. You will never allow your Holy One to undergo corruption or for his body to see decay. And then he goes on to say, David spoke, this is Peter. Peter says, David spoke those words, but they couldn't have been about David. Why? Because David's tomb is over here, right? It's public knowledge. David's dead. His body is undergoing decay. It has seen corruption. So Peter says, right, David was speaking as a prophet. He was speaking as a prophet about the coming Christ, right? And that Christ is the one who has not experienced, the Messiah has not experienced, his body has not experienced decay or corruption. He's the one who is at the right hand of God, as Psalm 110:1 says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. In other words, right, he's saying that basically Psalm 16 and Psalm 110 are prophecies of Christ's resurrection, where, and in the context, right, he's speaking this to a audience in Jerusalem saying, your leaders killed him. And God said, no, right? In other words, you're not going to have the last word on this, right? You've crucified him. I will raise him from the dead and exalt him, right, to my right hand in heaven. So the New Testament works in so much detail with that kind of theology. But at minimum, I guess my response here is to say, right, throughout the book of Acts and in a variety of other places, the resurrection of Christ, that God is the Father, is the one that resurrects Christ, functions basically as his big yes to Christ and his no to humanity who put him to death and killed him. It's his vindication. This is my son. He is my righteous one. He is the one who through whom I will accomplish all of my purposes.
So one of those purposes is soteriology then. How do we move from Christology related to all that you just said to Christ's saving work for us?
Right. One of the ways that I emphasize in the book, and it's something that, there's a variety of angles I could take in response to this question, but one of the main emphases of the book that I do talk about is that there is, let me put it this way, Christ's entire life is vicarious in that it is lived for humanity's sake and for our benefit. What I mean by that is sometimes the language of union with Christ or participation in Christ is the language that's spoken of to emphasize this. So let me just give one example I could give a couple examples. Let me give one example of what I mean by this. When the New Testament authors speak about Christ, the Messiah, being anointed by John the Baptist and receiving the Spirit, what's going on? What is going on there? Doesn't Jesus already have the Spirit? I mean, if, the pre-existent Christ, Father, Son, and Spirit, I mean, was there any, what's going on there, right? No, we don't need to engage in any affirmation that Christ was adopted by God or something along those lines. The church fathers had it right, and the New Testament texts, I think, give us clues to this. What is going on there is something that's taking place for you and for me and for humanity, right? Christ in his human body, right, receives the Spirit of God upon him, right, so that he might basically, to use language that Cyril of Alexandria uses on occasion, and Irenaeus, even earlier than that, talks this way, basically preserve the Spirit to human nature, right? So that when Christ stands up, or Jesus stands up in the Nazareth synagogue in Luke 4 and says, the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me, right? It goes on to flesh out what that means from Isaiah 58 and 61. That's the same Spirit, right, upon the divine human Jesus, that then we are made participants in, that we ourselves also share in. We could look at a variety of different angles of this, but Christ, one of the themes that the New Testament wants to communicate is basically that we're drawn together in a mysterious union with Christ. His messianic identity, his humanity, all of it is vicarious for us in terms of basically drawing us together into fellowship, union, participation with him, so that on the one hand, well, I'll just put it this way, so that basically our lives and our stories are 2,000 years later bear resemblance to his life, right? In terms of we are buried with Christ, we are baptized with Christ, we die crucified with Christ, we're raised with Christ. Even for Paul and at places in Ephesians, we are resurrected and throned together with Christ. All of that, I would argue, is basically a messianic narrative, right? That then, by virtue of him being the Messiah, the one who is simultaneously sharing God's representative, but also humanity's representative, is something then that he's able to give to us as a gift that we share in and participate in as well.
All right. Very encouraging. All right. So a lot of talk about Christ as Messiah, as king. So if he's king over his kingdom. Can you define for us your understanding of the kingdom of God?
Yeah, I think the kingdom, that's a good question. And in some ways it's a basic question and a question that I always wrestle with, giving sort of like a precise definition to that. I think of God's kingdom as something that is, on the one hand, we are still waiting for it. We are waiting for Romans, 8, 18 through 25 or so, when basically this cosmos will give way, as Paul says, the sons of God will be revealed. Creation itself is groaning and longing. Revelation, right, I think depicts this in a way in terms of, the new heavens, the new earth, the new Jerusalem coming down, the kingdom of earth, or the kingdom of God becomes, right, the kingdom then of man or of humanity. So I think of God's kingdom as basically, it is what, it's so hard to give just a precise definition of this, but it's basically, right, God's ultimate fulfillment of his expectations for humans and this world, where humans will live together in shalom and in peace. They will flourish with one another. There won't be violence. There won't be war. There won't be economic injustice. Any form of injustice will be there. So that's what I think we're waiting for and expecting for. And I think we get glimmers and foreshadows of that as prophecies in the Old Testament. Psalm 72 is as I know I've already mentioned it, and a variety of other places. Or let me go to a different one. Isaiah 11, that's speaking about a Spirit-anointed Messiah that will bring forth justice and truth, that will lead to the wilderness will give way to flourishing. Children will be able, as you probably know, right, the famous passages, will be able to live in peace with animals and, deadly vipers, so on and so forth. And I think we get foreshadows of that, right, in the New Testament, so that the kingdom is not readily identifiable. I'm squeamish about saying the kingdom is the church, for example. I'm squeamish about saying at any point the kingdom is that. right? I think we get foretastes of it, hopefully in the church. We better see some foretastes of it in the church, but places where basically we see the presence of Jesus leading to good and flourishing and peace and harmony and love for all people, not fully realized, not something that's necessarily concrete and that we can say, this is the kingdom, but hopefully that makes sense. Anticipations and glimmers of what we're all longing and waiting and expecting for, that's given to us in Revelation 21 and 22.
But you also talk about the election of individuals to share in the rule of Christ. What are you getting at there?
There I'm talking about how in the Old Testament, sort of as a context for Jewish messianism, we get these places where God is saying, essentially, I have promised that one day I am going to accomplish my purposes by means of a human agent. Like Ezekiel 34 is a good example. Sometimes God says, I will just do it. I will be their God. I will wipe out these wicked and unjust shepherds that are ruling over my people. I will do it myself. But then at times he says, I will do it by means of sending a righteous shepherd who will reign and rule over them. So God there is basically, we're getting a foretaste in the Old Testament, right? Indicating that he is going to use a human agent to accomplish his purposes. In the New Testament, we would say that, of course, is Jesus.
All right. And you write a lot about sanctification, and you talk about sanctification as embodying the character of Jesus. Could you go into more depth about that?
Yeah. In my classes at Trinity, I often say things like, especially, I say this in almost all my classes, but I probably emphasize it the most in the Gospels, that Christology and discipleship are integrally related. They are united together. So that when Jesus talks about who he is, what he's going to do, there's an expectation that his disciples are going to embody that same kind of character. So it's not a bad hermeneutic to look at the Gospels and say, who is Jesus? How did he live? How did he act? Disciples are also supposed to do that, right? If Jesus was one who embodied practices of humility or a low disposition when he could have had positions of power, disciples should be like that too. If Jesus was one that said, hey, the people on the bottom that are being exploited through those on the top, they need to be cared for and lifted up. We should be, it's sort of like in a very similar way as Jesus is sort of embodying this messianic identity that I think he finds and understands in part through the Old Testament scriptures. Then disciples are also to be a people that are following in the footsteps of Jesus. Maybe the easiest way to say it would be, 1 Peter 2:21 through 25, when he gives us a portrait of the Messiah who is embracing a low disposition for the good of others, we should expect that we should be, following in his same footsteps. And we could flesh that out with more practices, but that at least gives you an idea of what I mean by that.
Right. We'll get to that more because you talk about dynamics of power within the church and relation to the worldly kingdoms later in the book.
Right.
So you use the phrase, rather than faith in Christ or faith in Messiah, you talk about faith towards Messiah. So that's interesting there. What are you trying to get at there?
Yeah, I think at times it's probably my squeamishness of connotations that we have in English for the Greek word pistis. So the Greek word pistis, the English word often in our New Testaments is translated as faith. That's not a bad translation, but sometimes the connotations that we have are what James critiques in James 2 in terms of just an easy believism, or I believe this or something. Whereas pistis usually means something that is a little more concrete, I think, in the New Testament. Sometimes might be translated better. You can't do this and say every time pistis occurs, it means this, because it depends on the context. But in some instances, it would be better translated as pistis would be translated as loyalty. So one of our responses to the king, Matt Bates has written a really great book on this, Salvation by Allegiance Alone. His word for pistis is allegiance. But the right response toward a king that has saved and rescued us is not so much just, okay, I believe it. It's more one of we reciprocate through loyalty, through trust, through the obedience of pistis, the obedience of faith, as we get in Romans. Revelation talks about this as well in terms of, right, there is a group of followers of Jesus that are supposed to maintain the pistis of Jesus, or the faith of Jesus. Might mean to some extent more they are not just supposed to have intellectual beliefs about him, but they are to have concrete enacted forms of loyalty to him as they experience the temptation to compromise, or as they themselves experience their own suffering. So that's what I mean when I use that language.
All right. And what can you say then about Messianic theology and how it should inform both our fellowship? Take a look at that first, but then also our mission. I think a lot of believers, we forget about relationships within the church. We focus on ethics or mission, and so many churches today are shallow in terms of the depth of relationship between believers. So
yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think it's sort of to think, in some ways, some of the images that are given to us, and I won't give the argument for them being messianic, but are for our ecclesiology we are the body of the Messiah. He is the head who supplies the nourishment and growth, not just to me in my own individual life, but right as Colossians and 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 expand upon, supplies the nourishment and growth for, again, not just my good, but for the good of the entire community. Or in 1 Corinthians 10 through 14 or so, Paul, one of the things, Paul sometimes gets a bad rap in terms of being, super inflexible, and at times he can be on certain matters. But one of his ethics in 1 Corinthians 10 through 14 is just do what is good for the group, and the edification of the entire group. There shouldn't be one body, one set of individuals or group that's flourishing at the expense of the other. Right? This is a group identity. Where does that come from? It comes from him saying, this is how Christ lived among us. This is the messianic narrative of basically the Messiah who loved us and gave himself for us, right? Leading even to our main, one of our primary sacraments of the Lord's Supper, which is to be a visible display of our union with the Messiah, but also our unity together as the people of God.
And how about mission?
Yeah. So the question would just be, how does Messianic theology inform our mission? I mean, it would be, again, I would say in some ways like taking on the same practices of Christ. So let me talk about it in this way with respect to power. Our mission is not to say we need to sort of reclaim society for and impose our values on the world around us, and do so at all costs, no matter, the means justify, or the ends, the ends justify the means. That's not the mission that the New Testament sets forth.
We've had 1,700 years of experimentation with Christendom. It's a failed experiment.
And probably won't learn, but we need to keep trying and have hope. Right, but there's sort of like the mission is one of being faithful in terms of embodying the practices of Jesus, right? Like Jesus was one that was about peacemaking. He was one about economic justice and well-being and flourishing for all. He was one who embodied power through the renunciation of his rights and his privileges in order to love and to serve all people. So our mission, right, should flow out of that sense of trying to follow who the Messiah is, not who maybe we wish the Messiah would have been, or trying to recreate the Messiah in our own image, or saying we're doing this for the Messiah, but we know the means aren't quite the means he would use. We need to trust, I think, what he taught us in the New Testament. Yeah, that's all I'll say about, I guess, what I think our mission would be there. So.
All right. And there's other kingdoms too besides Christ. So how do we understand the kingdom of Christ, Christ's kingship, in relation to the kingdoms of this world? Of course, we've already touched on it, but if you could go into some more depth.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is this is the satanic, temptation that, Satan himself gives to Jesus, right? And Jesus is absolutely one of, I am not tempted by the power, the way that those kingdoms work. So I think one of the things we as Christians need to do is not be necessarily hostile or opposed to. I think God has, given us rulers and governments by and large, hopefully, for the common good. There are times, right, and for order, and we need to be usually a non-rebellious presence within that. But we need to all be very careful about not taking the standards of the kingdoms of the earth and the world as basically a smaller version of what the kingdom of Christ is really about. The kingdom of Christ is one that should subvert, critique, call us to a way of life that will simultaneously try to be a good influence or supportive and pursuing the common good, but at the same time, but knowing that our way of life will also at times bring us into deep conflict with the way that the kingdoms of the world work. When we fail to sort of make that kind of distinction, then too quickly the church loses its identity, or just becomes a wing of some other branch of politics, or, a nation state or something along those lines.
So we'll address that in more depth when we look at peacemaking and violence. But within the church then, the church might not be trying to take over the state or control the government, but the church seeks to have its way in many different situations. How can you describe the church's relationship to power from Messianic theology?
Yeah, I would probably just reaffirm what I said before, that the main role of the church is to be clear about following the way of Christ. So his practices, gentleness, humility, peacemaking, renunciation of violence, all of these sorts of things that are, not hard to figure out from a basic reading of the New Testament. Church needs to, in the first instance, understand that that's its role and its task. And at no point, in my view, should it sort of abdicate that role because they think there's a greater good that they need to pursue through the government or through a nation or something along those lines. That said, Romans 13, 1 Timothy 2, early church fathers flesh this out, right? Insofar as one is able, one should try to live within society in a non-rebellious way, right? And the church fathers, some of the second century apologists are helpful here in terms of they're being persecuted as Christians, and they're saying, yeah, it's true. We have limits in terms of what we can do as Christians. We're not going to make sacrifices to the emperor. We're not going to attend the gladiatorial games, things along these lines. But we are deeply good citizens committed to virtues of things like, justice and piety and so on and so forth. We pay our taxes. We don't revolt. We don't, so on and so forth. We have our own way of life. And insofar as you sort of like don't encroach upon that or engage in mass, right, sort of destruction of other humans' lives, right, we're happy to mind our own business and be a good presence within society. But the church's first order is to be clear about its identity and its relationship to Christ and following the practices that he teaches us.
All right, so let's get even more specific here as you write about peacemaking and rejection of violence. Exactly what do you mean? Are there no exceptions to this, or is there a place for just war, or do Christians always to take a pacifistic pacifistic stance. And along with that, then, the other specificity I'm looking at is, okay, if Christians are to not take positions of power, can we be elected officials where we are mayors that have authority over a police force, or presidents that are commanders-in-chief of military forces? Where do we draw the line?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, I'm going to punt a little bit in terms of just saying it goes way outside the argument that I'm trying to make here. And it's probably better left for, ethicists, political theologians. I mean, those are really good questions. Then the role, that Augustine and, the City of God or the Anabaptists, right, in terms of how they handle, right, these questions are going to work through this. So they're vitally important. They're just not really a theme or a focus in terms of, right, what I'm trying to do is sort of say, here are what the way of life that the New Testament texts call us to, right? So that whatever decision you give, whether it's just war, whether it's pacifism, you're going to be accountable to these texts and the articulation of some of the themes that I talked about in the past two questions. And when we make ethical decisions or we're involved in political theology, we're going to be, we're also going to be doing more than just sort of like a strict exegesis of texts. We're going to be bringing in a lot of things like church history and church tradition, other sources that are going to provide norms or resources for, let me just say resources for how we're going to articulate the answers to the question that you raised, which are really good. They're just, more in the realm of the ethicist or the political theologian than they are a New Testament theology book.
All right. You also talk about economic practices that reflect Messianic theology. What are your thoughts about that?
So it would be, when Jesus, for example, is describing his Messianic identity as one, for example, who waits on tables in Luke 22. He describes basically, our translations may have one who serves. He's saying who's greater? Is it the one who serves or is it the one who sits at the table? Right. And the disciples say, well, of course, society says it's the one who sits at the table. And Jesus says, how have I been in your midst? I have been in your midst as one who serves or as one who waits on tables. Goes on to then say, you also have that role. Don't be like the Gentiles or the kingdoms of the world, right, that love to use their positions to be called benefactors. They use their possessions, right, to stabilize their power, to increase sort of their reputation. Jesus again is saying, I've not been that way. And then he says in verses 28 through 30, and I've given to you a kingdom, right, that you, as the Father has given to me, so I give to you, in order that you would eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. What does all this mean? Right? Basically within the Gospel of Luke and then the second volume, which is Acts of the Apostles, basically what it means to wait on tables is Jesus' form of basically saying, right, disciples are those that are characterized not by wealthy hoarding of possessions, whether that is literal possessions or that's name and reputation and power that comes with it. So that one of the classic examples who embodies what Jesus is teaching is actually Barnabas in Acts 4, 32 through 37, who's one of these wealthy landowners, right? But basically, to be a landowner is a way that you move up, right? You use your society's sort of patron-client scale. You are able to stabilize wealth for yourself. Barnabas basically renounces that, gives it up for the good of the church. So it's a way of life, in other words, that is oriented towards economic well-being and flourishing of other people. That's not about trying to procure or secure one's own existence by means of hoarding or power or gathering possessions.
All right, and that also touches on solidarity with the marginalized. You write more about that. What is significant for us to understand about that?
So, right. So we are going to, if we're right, living the Barnabas lifestyle or the way that he lives in terms of Jesus' messianic identity, that means that basically there's an understanding that there are people that are on the bottom of society's scale in terms of wealth and power. And we are going to not be viewing the goal of life as sort of like moving closer to those with wealth and power, but rather that we're going to be listening to those and having solidarity, even in terms of our lifestyle, with those who are on the margins, just like Jesus did, as he said he came to do in Luke 4:16-30. The Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news, gives those categories to the blind, to the oppressed, to bring release, right, basically to the captives. Right, the disciples follow in Jesus' ministry of release, or for shalom, peace, flourishing, not by sort of taking the role of bishops that are high, right, and powerful and removed from the affairs of those that are low, but by living in proximity to them. So that's what I mean by that.
All right, and to backtrack somewhat, you already touched some on the fathers, but could you talk a little more about early fathers and what they said that contributes to Messianic theology?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question in terms of the New Testament certainly is using a variety of resources to understand the identity of Jesus. But one of the things I found interesting was the way in which, the early church fathers like Ignatius of Antioch and Justin Martyr and Irenaeus are drawing upon texts like Romans 1:1-5, that's talking about God's gospel as one that centers upon, in verse 3, a Davidic Messiah. And they make a lot of it there in verse 3, right, that he's incarnate, that he has to, right, the Greek text is, right, he is the seed of David, right, according to the flesh, kata sarka. In other words, he has to wear our flesh. And then in verse 4, right, he is the one from the house of David who is resurrected, exalted at God's right hand, and is able to give forth the Holy Spirit. So one of the things I was struck by was how many of the church fathers look at those verses, Romans 1:1-5, which really do set forth sort of like a messianic identity and story of Jesus to as robust resources for their own theology.
And how about scholars in later times, medieval or the reformers? What's significant or interesting for you there?
Yeah, I pretty much stopped with the church fathers just in terms of my own limitations of my own expertise. They certainly will develop the threefold offices that you get more prominently in the Reformation period in terms of prophet, priest, and king. And so obviously the king aspect would fit nicely with what I'm arguing here. And one, perhaps I'm not the one to do it, but one perhaps could examine the New Testament texts in the way I've done it, using the categories of priest and prophet. So I didn't delve too much into the threefold offices of Christ that you start to be prevalent in the Reformation, but that would be the place that you would look, I think, to sort of see some of the similar themes.
And you also mentioned that relatively few modern contemporary scholars are writing about Messianic theology in the New Testament, and apparently that's one reason you are interested in writing on it. What can you say about the most modern scholarship on this issue?
Well, I would actually say, let me nuance that in terms of actually saying I would view myself as a part of a trajectory or a group of those that are reacting to what has been prevalent for a while, at least in modern New Testament scholarship, which was basically when Paul uses Christos 270 times. To some people, it's looked as though it just was a name and not a title. And some have said, Paul and the New Testament would have drawn its theology from Davidic sort of, notion that's doesn't have themes of suffering and renunciation, I think wrongly. And so Paul wouldn't have used Davidic sort of concepts to understand. That's what I would say and then a part of, some others like Matt Novenson and Matt Bates, and there's some others that are sort of reacting against that. So there are more out there, and I should actually give, shout outs to people like that have maybe prepared some of the way for some of our arguments, to people like N.T. Wright, and a lot of his work in his Christian origins books. So I'm not like a lone voice in the wilderness, but have certainly been, formed and shaped by my own contemporaries, and then, people like N.T. Wright, who is a predecessor, or predecessor. He's at least, he's an older scholar than I am, right? I'll just leave it at that. And his works were influential. But yeah, we're reacting in some ways against the notion that Messiah is just basically a name.
All right. And some voices within the church, and especially outside of the church, perhaps feminist voices or anti-imperialist or critical theory oriented, react against the notion of king altogether for different reasons. They're more egalitarian. What would you say to them? Why do you think it's important to, in this contemporary social situation we find ourselves in, why is it important to see Christ as king?
Yeah. First of all, I think that there are very good reasons for feminist scholars, a variety of different scholars. There's a very good reason for me, for all of us, to be careful and nervous about the ways in which Messianic theology could be used. So, right, there's a long history of basically the abuse of all kinds of people by certain forms of power that are wrapped up in kings or wrapped up in a, patriarchal society. And so I don't read them and sort of say, it's just awful or anything like that. I view their voices as important and ones that we need to keep listening to, because the truth of the matter is New Testament, religious language, New Testament language can often be used in certain ways to harm and oppress people. Now, I don't think the New Testament texts are supposed to do that or are trying to do that, because I think the portrait of the king that they give to us is one that we would say that doesn't fit very closely with what we think of as a king. A king that basically, right, is vindicated by God and does have power, but, right, establishes his kingdom by means of peacemaking, by means of renunciation of violence, by means of attention to those on the marginal, that are marginalized, right? That's not usually what we think of when we think of kings. And so I think it gives to us a depiction of many of our longings for someone like a Psalm 72 king that will rule with peace and justice and righteousness for all people, and will do so not as a way to advantage himself, but for the good of others. The Old Testament knows this. All the scriptures know this. When the Israelites ask for a king, Samuel the prophet says to him, this is what he's going to do. And the word that's repeated over and over is take. He's going to take, right? Deuteronomy 17, which gives to us the law of the king, says, this is the one thing that Israel's king is supposed to do. Love God with all his heart, mind, soul, and strength, pretty much, by following the Torah. Basically, it's just to be a Torah lover, right? And and then you get a list of what he's not supposed to do. Deuteronomy 17 has to be related to 1 Samuel 8 through 12 in some way, because what he's not supposed to do is take. So the Bible itself has a very suspicious view of kings, a very suspicious view of kings. Suspicious might be an understatement. The feminist critics, those that are worried about, theocracy, things along these lines, they're following in a very biblical trajectory to raise suspicions and concerns. My only response would be to say basically, yes, that's right. But the portrait of the kingship of Christ that we get is one that is not of a patriarchal, abusive king that, advantages himself at the expense of others.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think that's really important distinction, because otherwise you could just, if you're triggered by this word king, then we'll change it to something softer, but then you're missing the whole point of what Jesus is trying to do politically and socially and what he expects of his followers.
Right.
All right. So you talk about eschatology. You write about waiting for his final enactment of his just rule over creation. So what's foundational for developing our eschatology in light of Messianic theology?
Yeah, it is really, that basically I think there is this day of the Lord, this day of Christ. I'll be brief with this as I have to run in a minute here. Day of the Lord, day of Christ, right? That is, right, coming out of an expression from the prophets that whether it's God himself in some of the texts or whether it's his Messiah or agent that will do it, that basically there's going to be a day when Christ reigns and rules supreme for the good, for the flourishing of all people. All of us have that longing and that expectation, I think, for peace, for justice, for the well-being of all people. In the New Testament, in its eschatology, when it uses messianic language, I think is tapping into a lot of that longing and hope that we have.
All right, good words. Well, I'm Dennis Metzler. You've been listening to The Charge. We've been talking about Messianic Theology with Dr. Joshua Jipp, Professor of New Testament at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and the author of the Messianic Theology of the New Testament. It's available. Just follow the link below. Dr. Jipp, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for your questions. It's been fun to talk with you, Dennis.
All right. Peace to everyone.
All right.
I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at thecharge.info@gmail.com. Please check out our other videos. Don't forget to hit like and click on subscribe.